a novelist. It was actually quite shocking, the difference when I first encountered it. And also a little bit about the overlap between ethnography and fiction, although that's now minimal. In fact, it may already be entirely gone because it's more scholarly. And then I want to touch on the process of selling the work and selling the writer. And the role of history and place, how I go about writing the novel, the role of history, place, and also in the novels there are also these moral questions that I try to deal with. So how I started writing novels, well, ever since I learned to speak English, I have wanted to be a writer. I don't know why, it's one of those mysterious things. And so I, like many other people, have a box of unfinished novels lying under my bed. And when I got tenure, I was kind of exhausted. I'd just written 2 scholarly books, and then everyone said, "What's your next project?" And I'm like, "Next project? I'm so exhausted. I want to do something different." And so I started writing a novel, a mystery, because I like to read mysteries. And for, this time I finished it, because I had tenure, I could do that. And I finished it, and to my great surprise, I found an agent. They loved it, they wanted more, and I ended up writing 3 of these Kamil Pasha novels. And then the next question presented itself: should I write under a pseudonym? Right? Because traditionally, if you're an academic and you start writing popular stuff, it's supposed to be bad for your image as an academic. But I did so much research for these books, I wanted credit. I did as much research for these novels as I do for anything else. And so I decided to just use my own name. And then, to my big surprise, my colleagues were actually very supportive. And every time I went to a meeting, all these secret scholarly novelists would come out of the woodwork and say, "Hey, I have this box of novels under my bed. How did you get an agent? Can you tell me?" So it turns out that it was more popular among my colleagues than I expected. But it's also, so I ended up writing a novel about every 2 years or so, which was really hard to do because I have a day job. I'm a professor. And, that's a very time-consuming thing. So, you were talking weekends, holidays, evenings. So it's a kind of really lonely thing to do. And ironically, I live in Boston, which is full of writers who live there, but I don't know any of them because I'm always so busy writing. I never get out, and I don't even know where to meet them. They're probably all writing as well. So, so then funny things began to happen. So the first thing that was a clue that the writer's life is not the same as a scholar's life is that when the Sultan's Seal was published, right after that, I went to the Middle East Studies Association's meeting of scholars, right? And at the reception, a friend of mine came up to me and said, "You know that person over there across the room? She wants to know, is Jenny White a lesbian?" What? It turns out, I'm not. It turns out that, in this novel, there is a lesbian triangle, but there's also a heterosexual relationship and a whole bunch of murders. So, I'm just waiting for someone to come up and say, "Is Jenny White a murderer?" So the whole thing is that, the thing I learned from this is that a writer's personal life and history become fodder, become important for not only the people selling the book, but the people buying the book. It was very disconcerting. Have you ever noticed that in reviews of novels, when they write reviews, they always talk about, she had torrid affairs, or, his father beat him. It's like, why is that in a review? I started noticing this for the first time after I started publishing novels, and people were very interested in my personal life. When you do readings, people ask personal questions. They feel like, especially after they've read the books, they feel like they know you personally. Which for a scholar, when you write a book of scholarship, nobody cares about your personal life. So it's very, very uncomfortable. At least initially. I think I've kind of gotten a handle on it now. So there's also a pressure from the publisher to kind of reveal yourself. in this way. You know, not only at readings, but also a website, a blog, Twitter, and so on. You know, you're supposed to put yourself out there, get naked. It's like, oh. Self-revelation, let people get close to you, because then they'll like you better and they'll buy more of your novels. Think about that. So the readings also were really different from any kind of scholarly talk, like the one I'm not really giving now. Readings are much more like vaudeville, right? Really, you get up there, you do this little reading from the book, and then you make people laugh, you march through the audience with a microphone. And it's like, I've never done that before. I had to practice doing that, which of course doesn't work that well. But eventually I discovered my inner clown, and I actually started to like it, and it was very funny because it affected my teaching. So I became a much more relaxed teacher. You know, all of this contradicts the scholar's pose, you know, where I'm in charge, I'm in control of what's being said, I'm just in control of the situation. This is totally out of control. You know, beyond you're actually reading the text, everything else is kind of up for grabs. You have no idea what people are going to ask, or what you'll say in response. And also, I thought, well, okay, this could be fun, right? So you have these multiple public and private personas that people are interested in. So surely authors must dress differently. So my very first literary party that I was invited to in Boston, in this fancy apartment downtown, and so I thought, okay, I'm a novelist now. So I wore a black catsuit and a kimono. And I went to this party. I thought it looked great, you know, very novelistic-like. So I went to the party, and I discovered to my horror that novelists dress just like anybody else. And so I was completely the odd person, the odd cat out. So let me talk a little bit about the relationship between ethnography and fiction. It's not really such a big leap from one to the other. Both of them involve stories. So in an ethnography, you take what is real, what you observe, you extract a pattern, and you look for some kind of explanation or meaning. So all of my scholarly books do that. In fiction, you take what is real and you embroider it. You elaborate it. You make it more real. With the idea that a good story has some kind of deeper truth to it. So, as I talk about my scholarly books, I won't. So let's get to the nitty-gritty of writing the novel. Okay, so what are some of the anthropological skills beyond, you know, the writing that transfer to writing fiction? So for one thing, is research. I do know how to do research. And you do, especially if it's a historical novel, but also for the novel that I just finished writing, which is in the present, you know, it's set partly in Mali. You gotta do research about Mali. You can't just make up Mali. So when I wrote The Sultan's Seal, I was on Fulbright in Istanbul, and I was staying at AFOT, American Research Institute in Turkey, which has this fabulous library on 2 or 3 floors of Ottoman books. And so I would spend all day out doing interviews and doing my regular research, and then at night I'd be creeping around the library, and I systematically went through the entire AFOT library, and I looked at every book about the Ottoman period. This is 1880s, 1886, the next book's 87 and 88. So everything I could find about 86. And I wrote all this down, and I made voluminous photocopies, and I schlepped it all back with me, and that became the basis for some of it. But you really have a responsibility to be accurate. So I'm trying to figure out, were the streets of Beirut paved in 1886? right? What were their street lamps? How do you find that stuff out? It's not on Google. And so I discovered on my bookshelves at home the Istanbul Encyclopedia, which many years ago I had in a fit of, I don't know what, carried this huge encyclopedia in my suitcase from Turkey and put it on my shelf and never looked at it again until now. And I realized everything is in there. The sidewalks, just everything you possibly might want to know about Istanbul through the ages. It's the most remarkable, I mean, it's a huge encyclopedia, most remarkable set of books. So I used that a lot. Then, what were the street names? They're not the same as the street names now. So then I started searching for maps. There's something called the Goad map, which is an insurance map of the Beyoğlu area. That was, I think it was 1904. And it was from a French insurance company that insured most of that area. And so the map has on it each house and each business, and there's actually an addendum to it where you can then see who lived there and what they did. It's the most remarkable document. And so I stole some of my names of characters from those lists, and I also figured out what some of the street names were. Of course, 1880s is a little bit earlier, but I bought some maps from that period, some actual maps of Istanbul, and used my magnifying glass. I did the best I could. But still, there are glitches. And the minute the Sultan Seal was published, I got an email from a historian in Turkey who said, "You have Kamil walking past the university in Beyazıt Square. The university was not built until later." And I'm like, oh my God. So I look up the Istanbul Encyclopedia, which indeed has a map of Beyazıt Square in 1880s. And it's some other building. So in the paperback, I changed it. So I fixed it. However, as the mistakes multiply, there's a limit to whether you could do that or not. And in fact, one of my big mistakes, which I only realized after when I was writing the third book, is that I clapped people in the Sultan Ahmet jail. But there was no Sultan Ahmet prison in the 1880s. In fact, there were no prisons, because the whole concept of prison came from Europe in the 19th century. I mean, in the 20th century, the early 20th century. And so I thought, okay, there are no prisons. Where do they put prisoners? So it turns out all those towers lying around everywhere, they're really good for prisoners. You slap them in there, or you exile them. You know, people who committed crimes were often just exiled. And I found one place, the Bekir Ağa Kışlası, which is a kind of military area that was used for political prisoners. I was like, haha. And I actually found a photo of it, probably in the Istanbul Encyclopedia, or a drawing of it, and I could try to recreate it. So in the third book, that's corrected. However, there's a huge glitch. Has anyone read it? Does anyone know what a glitch is? What is it?
I mean, it's not correct, perhaps. Historically, there's a
slip.
I mean, it's a kind of a decoration of your book, but may not be historically correct, so it's...
Okay, all right, we'll talk about that later. The glitch I was referring to, I know there are many, is that I set a lot of the third book in the neighborhood of Kurtuluş. Ooh, yeah, really bad. Which, of course, could not possibly have had that name in the 1880s, right? But it's all over the book, as it's too late to change it, so I'm sorry. So one of the things that is interesting about writing about history in a novel is that it makes current events or historical events much more immediate than a scholarly book, or even a media account, because the characters in novels are people you care about. I mean, that's what makes a successful novel, is if you care about the people. So why did I pick the 1880s, the Ottoman 1880s? Something about that period spoke to me, and I wanted to kind of share that. It was maybe a bit of nostalgia. It was a very colorful, fertile period. People wore interesting clothing. They had wonderful architecture, fascinating customs. It was this culmination of a 500-year empire that was still all around. It still existed. And it existed on top of older civilizations, like the Byzantines. So it was truly multi-ethnic, multi-denominational. There were Jews, Armenians, Greek Orthodox Christians, and many other types of people. They held very important positions. They were the doctors, the merchants, the bankers, the craftsmen, advisors to the Sultan. They were servants. The servants were mostly non-Muslim. Armenian architects built these big mosques that we see now. There was a lot of mingling in the same households, on the streets. Travelers would write about the babel of languages in the streets of Perak, of Beyoğlu, and also the different costumes. But at the same time, it was this period of profound change. There was a lot of French and European influence in the urban areas like Istanbul, and you can see the shape of the future in society and in politics, but it hasn't happened yet. So I like that sense of imbalance, that things are still preserved, yet change is happening. So for the book, I do three things. For each book, I do three things. First, I let the characters drive the plot, rather than the plot determining what the characters will do, so that you have a sense of personal identification with them. I kind of have the kernel of the plot, the central problem, and then I flesh in the characters and kind of let them loose. And often they surprise me. So they insinuate themselves. It's kind of like a Ouija board, where I'm writing, but it's not me. I just have my finger on the Ouija board and it's moving around making words. It's a very odd thing to happen, that it's sort of an out-of-body experience. And so sometimes these minor characters that I stick in at the various ways, they demand larger roles, and they take them without my being able to do anything about them. So one of them is Kamil's sidekick, Omar, who is a police chief of the Fatih district. He's like this morally ambiguous ex-soldier with a very colorful personality, and I put him in initially as his sidekick without any big role. And then he becomes a major person in the other two books. And then there was Avi. Avi's a little boy who has one step-on, step-off scene in the first book. He brings something to Kamil and then he disappears. Then suddenly he reappears in the second book as a major character, and then remains that way. But I can take no credit for this because I don't know that it happens until it's happened. In the third book, Feride, Kamil's sister, becomes a major character, and she had always been kind of peripheral. So the second thing I do is make sure that the characters are truly of their time and place. So Kamil is a modern Ottoman. He is educated in England. He's a believer in science. He's not religious. He doesn't really believe in religion. His passion is raising orchids and studying orchids. But he worries about what will happen if everybody casts off family and religious obligations and become these individuals who do whatever they want, right? So he worries what's going to hold the fabric of society together if that happens, if everybody becomes like me. And he worries about the costs of being modern. What will happen to the colorful customs and tapestry of being Ottoman? Are we all just going to become British? What a horrible thought for him. And then, because these are times of great upheaval, he gets involved in a variety of disturbing things where he has to make moral choices. And he begins to question things so that he thought were absolutely clear, like what is justice? Right? You think he's He's a magistrate, he should know that. He thinks he knows that. He thinks he knows what's right and wrong, but in dealing with the situations that come up in the books, he becomes unsure of these things. In The Winter Thief, for instance, he tries to stop a massacre and ends up helping the people that he was supposed to arrest, and then basically being accused of committing treason. Right? And so the question is, did he do the right thing? Did he not? He doesn't know. He's a Muslim who doesn't believe in God until in the third book, in the Abyssinian Proof, he's confronted by an ancient reliquary that contains what many believe is the proof of God. And despite his initial skepticism, he too is moved to believe. Maybe. So there are always stories behind the stories here. And thirdly, I always make the city of Istanbul itself a character in the books, and I'll return to that. So that politically, the empire is dying at this point. The Ottoman provinces have been eaten away by Europe, by Russia, in the Russo-Turkish War, 1977 to 78. The Russians were actually visible, their campfires were visible from Istanbul. So that's a scene in the Sultan's Seal, where one of the women in the harem, whose uncle is a Russian general, is looking out and thinking, is that one of his campfires? In the 1878 Congress of Berlin, that reduced Ottoman holdings in the Balkans. They lost Bulgaria, Macedonia, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Cyprus, and so on. This is huge changes happening. And in each of those places, there are massacres. As the Ottoman Empire is pushed back, as the Ottoman governors are pushed out, the local Christian populations often go after the Muslim populations. And so the roads are full, the roads in these areas are full of desperate people Muslims trying to get to Turkey, and many of them end up in Istanbul, on the streets of Istanbul, which makes Istanbul a very volatile place. Also, lots of bandits. These areas become very lawless. So all of this becomes the backdrop to the various stories that involve people. So the backdrop, you can think of the history that I've selected for each book. The history is like the stage scenery. And then in front of the stage scenery, you have people interacting with the scenery, in the context of these historical events, but interacting with each other on a personal level. That would be the plot. So, in the Sultan's Seal, the Sultan's Seal is set against the British ambitions in the Ottoman province of Syria, what they called the Great Game. The British supported the Arab rebellions, and in the novel, the British tried to get a mole into the Ottoman palace inside the royal family, and they do it through the harem, because the harem is full of women who are extremely powerful and wealthy and interacting with the outside world through their eunuchs. So I'm trying to, in some ways, not be Orientalist about this, giving the women themselves some agency, and not presenting them as sort of pretty playthings, which they were not. The Ottoman harem was a very serious institution. There was another thread also that plays through here, which is the Ottoman revolutionaries who wanted a parliament, and one of the characters is one of these people. The story, the actual plot, the story begins with the discovery of a dead foreign woman, naked, who is found floating just off the Ortaköy Mosque, behind the Ortaköy Mosque. And she's naked, but she has the Sultan's seal in a locket around her neck, which implies that she has some connection to the palace, but she's British. So, what's the connection? And I'm not going to tell you, you have to read the book. Who kills who, what's the connection with the great game? But the thing is that in order to write the plot, I have a number of voices. Okay, so there are several people, not just Kamil Pasha. There is also a young Muslim woman called Canan, who has her own voice and her own story. And then there is Sybil, the daughter of the British ambassador, who also has her story. We often hear her voice as she writes letters to her sister in England. But all these threads at some point come together in a climax, which I won't tell you about. The Abyssinian proof takes place at the time that Macedonia is lost. Russia took it, and the British brokered an agreement to give it back. And, it's quite a complicated process. But meanwhile, the people in Macedonia started killing each other. And, Christians against Muslims, but there were also Christians against Christians within these communities. The Ottoman army didn't help. It was forcing men and boys at gunpoint to join them in Macedonia. And then the streets of Istanbul were teeming with refugees escaping this chaos. And one of these refugees is Elif, who is an artist and a cousin to Hussein, that's Kamil's brother-in-law, Ferid, his husband, who just, manages to escape. She dresses as a man, manages to escape through bandit territory, and shows up on Hussein's doorstep. So there's another thread now of a story that will intersect with Kamil and other stories. Kamil, for instance, corners a young Macedonian loyalist who has just assassinated Macedonia's Ottoman governor while he was visiting Istanbul. So that's yet another story. And they all come together. They're just different threads, different voices against this one backdrop. So the Abyssinian proof revolves around a sacred object with enormous power. So this is the plot. The enormous power that was lost in Constantinople on the eve of the conquest of the Turks in 1453. And the book opens with that scene. And it reemerges 400 years later in 1887 Ottoman Istanbul, which is where all these things that I just described are also happening. Kamil thinks that it's one of these many sacred objects that are being stolen and ending up in Europe. Right? They're being stolen from all these places of worship, both Christian and Muslim and Jewish, and they're ending up in Europe for sale. And it's important because both sides think that the other side is doing the thieving. And because the situation is so inflamed between Christians and Muslims, it is stoking violence in the streets. And so Kamil is under a lot of pressure to solve this. Who's doing the stealing? So what he doesn't know is that this sacred object is something quite different. It's not just an artifact. He encounters a sacred sect called the Melicites, who are devoted to protecting this object. And he discovers that there are people who will stop at nothing, including murder, to get it. So I have to tell you something about the Melicites. I made them up. But I'm an anthropologist. I know all about sects and what they do and so on. So I was apparently so realistic that I got an email from a pastor